Okay, yes, this is John Miles, and I'm going to be showing some information I've put together on the iris and emotion dynamics. My background is I studied computer science and then immediately went into ophthalmology research at University of Michigan, and that's where I first saw the iris and taking pictures. And then I got very interested in the iris only, so I came down to here in Southern California to work with Bernard Jensen, at which point I immediately began to develop improved cameras because I saw that it needed a little bit of upgrade. And since then, since around 1995, I've been doing Rayid research, and that's my main focus, along with understanding everything about the iris. So the context is that I've been studying the iris and iris interpretation and working on iris camera technology since about 1990. And I'm an iris researcher. I'm not actually a clinical practitioner, so I have plenty of time to study the theory and to do research and development. And along the way, I've acquired quite a good understanding of the Rayid model, and I also like to question all the beliefs I have seen about the iris, and I like to ask the difficult questions. I will cover these topics first briefly. Iris photography, that's how I got started, and that's how I became interested in the details about the iris, and specifically the color and texture. And I'll show some of my main observations about the iris over these past 26 years, and show how the features vary and the development of the iris color and texture, which is primarily during gestation and the second half of gestation. And what I've come to see is that the iris is primarily, as I see it, an indicator of the emotional injuries and epigenetic effects that the growing baby, the fetus, is subjected to. And due to the importance of the emotions, as I've found in the accuracy of the Rayid model, and the need for people to have emotional health as a foundation for all other health, I have developed some equations of emotion and different methodologies for affecting the healing of emotions. So here's the iris, and as you can see, there's quite a bit of textural variation and color, and these are the two main attributes of the iris, and this is what I've been studying all this time. And I'd like to point out that all those tiny little fibers are actually blood vessel capillaries, and we are actually looking at a vascular bed. The arterial system is on the top surface going inwards towards the center of the iris. At the pupil, the blood cells take a U-turn and head back out through the venous system. So I figure I've spent about 15,000 hours over these years on research and development of iris photography, and that's been my main focus. But an important secondary focus is also understanding what the iris is all about, and about 12,000 hours on that, I estimate. And equally important, of course, is I've been researching all the many methods that are out there for improving one's well-being. And that is actually the whole point of studying the iris. For the practitioner, it's a way to guide the health recommendations. So iris photography I'll just briefly cover first, because this is our primary source for information about the iris, and after you've seen thousands of them, you kind of get a pattern and you understand what it's about. But in order to get accurate images, there is a need to control these usual photographic factors of focus, composition, illumination, and exposure. And the reason I've thought this was important, because I've seen many poor quality photographs over the years. These have led many practitioners to false claims that the iris has changed in some obvious way in response to the therapies that they are recommending, such as nutritional plans, supplements, cleansing programs, almost as if they need to show and demonstrate that their methodologies have had some beneficial effect. However, the reality is the iris doesn't really change very much. So for getting an accurate understanding and image of the iris, I first developed central lighting and later side lighting, and the side lighting tends to work better for the brown iris, but the most important factor here is this: the illumination of the iris during photography must be controlled. Likewise, we need to minimize reflections and glare in order to see the iris clearly. So the initial model I've developed was central lighting, and this would allow for accurate measurement and uniform illumination of the iris rather than having one side much darker than the other. Here's an example of a central lighting image, and as you can see there's lots of detail, and you can see that there's very little glare and reflection, and that the details are visible throughout the entire range of the iris. This is a good quality image. Later, more recently, I've developed side lighting cameras, and I came out with two different types. One with the fixed side lighting that has the angle of illumination on right and left fixed at the standard 45-degree reference angle. And for other types of illumination, such as extreme side lighting or IPB imaging, after Dr. Lorito, there's an adjustable version of the side lighting, which is also a 2-channel illuminator. As you can see in this picture, the brown iris has quite a bit of texture, and the details of the quality of the front surface of the iris is especially important in the brown iris. Unlike the blue iris, which has a transparent layer and you can see right through it to see the radial vessels, the brown iris requires a good visualizing of the surface texture. Here's another example of a brown iris. Yeah. So we were discussing the importance of side lighting for the brown iris. As you can see in this example here, there's quite a bit of textural feature, including the circumferential contraction folds and other qualities that are not too present in the blue iris. And then I came out with a 3-channel, which has both a choice between the center or right or left illumination, and that's what these cameras are about, both with the fixed 45-degree angle and the adjustable angles on the side. Here's an example of the same person taken with both central and side lighting. As you can see, the central lighting is nice because it keeps all the reflections in the pupil area, but the side lighting actually gives us a little bit of shadow effect. And later, more recently, I have a third type of camera, which is just the direct flash illumination. These are very inexpensive. You can get this type of camera for initially an upgrade later, but as you can see, it gives a pretty good detailed image of the iris as well. I've also made adjustable brightness focus lights in all the cameras, and that's because I found it's important to control the pupil diameter. You need to be able to adjust the brightness, because some people will overreact to the light and others will not. But you need to, ideally the pupil would be about 3 millimeters in diameter. So with the adjustment you can get the pupil to the standard diameter. Otherwise, when you're taking pictures and the person has a large pupil, as you can see here, the same person has quite a different appearance when their pupil is much larger. The radial vessels are spread apart a bit more, and it looks quite a bit different. My observations of the iris patterns are, first, that color and texture are the two main aspects to any iris pattern. Second is that changes in this iris pattern are extremely minimal. which is one reason why it's being used for identification as a very reliable biometric indicator that changes very, very little during one's life. Color changes a little bit more than the texture. The texture doesn't really change at all, but the color over several years or decades, you can pick up small increases in the pigment patches. You can see individual pigment granules appearing after some time. Also about the iris patterns, that traditional beliefs that it serves as a kind of a health readout with the color and texture indicating the client's current health problems, and later when that was hard to prove, people said, well, those are potential problems, but that's not very accurate. And according to Ellen Jensen, this belief has recently been downplayed, even deprecated, or even discarded by those who are more progressive, such as the IPA members. However, in the people I've contacted with interest in cameras, you would be surprised how many people are still teaching that, that the inherent weaknesses and the color spots are drug deposits and toxic settlements in the digestive tract. It really is not widely recognized that that is an obsolete belief. So the Forer effect, and also known as the Barnum effect, refers to the tendency of people to rate sets of statements about themselves as very accurate, even though the statements could just be generic. So Professor Forer observed individuals will give high accuracy ratings to descriptions when they thought they were getting a special report, even though they were vague and generic. In 1948, the psychologist gave a questionnaire to a group of students, and they were told that they'd each receive a personalized, specialized personality assessment based on their test results. And a week later, he gave each student a report and asked them to rate it on how well it applied. However, the reality is each student got the same exact report. But on the average, the students thought these reports were extremely accurate to them specifically, and they reported the accuracy as about 4.26 on a scale of 0 to 5. After they turned in all their ratings, he revealed that every student had received an identical report that Professor Forer put together from a newsstand astrology book. So people who are using iridology or Rayid and even learning this methodology need to be very cautious about the Forer effect. As mentioned, there are two major aspects to the iris pattern, and first is texture. This, again, really doesn't change once a person is born, and it relates to the density of the stromal vessels, the radial vessels, sometimes called fibers, the lacuna or gaps where these don't have a straight direction but go around in a circle, and the rarefaction or the separation of these vessels or fibers as they're sometimes termed. And second is the color, the chromatic variations around the iris, which is all based on the distribution of pigment or the absence of pigment, which have two different types, and generally speaking, the brown and yellow pigments are eumelanin, and the orange, or if it's reddish, that's pheomelanin, which is what gives red-haired people their color in their hair, pheomelanin. The texture, though, is definitely understood as now these days as a constitutional trait, and these are structural attributes of the iris, but they are developed during gestation. They are determined, so to speak, in the manufacturing process. They're formed before the person is born. And the texture reflects various genetic and epigenetic factors that are present prior to birth. And it's now known that prenatal factors can be correlated to health tendencies in the adult, both physical and emotional. And this is one reason why I appreciate the Rayid model so much, because it does go to the emotional attributes of a person. John Dogman, who's a leader in iris recognition, has also reported on what he calls their epigenetic randomness and of the iris pattern. And I would say there's nothing truly random. That's just a catchphrase, meaning they don't really know what leads to a specific iris pattern. Epigenetics has several mechanisms, but it refers to the process outside the DNA sequence that can affect how the genetics are expressed. And so methylation is one example, and DNA methylation is where a methyl group is attached to the molecule, and it prevents the expression of that. So it's kind of a switch to turn genes on and off, even though it doesn't affect the gene sequence, the chromosome sequence. Here's another diagram showing the two methyl groups attached at a certain site, and that prevents the transcription of the following series of genetic data. So the iris texture that we find are generally including either the lacuna, where the fibers are separating, rarefaction, where there's spread apart more than usual. And in this example, you can also see at a nexus of vessels there where they come together, there's often a little bit of a punctate pigmentation, little dots of pigment. They tend to coalesce right around where these blood vessels aggregate. That's a trait of the pigment. And it's kind of like some people are into tearing their genes. It's called the ripped genes interest. And there's both fiber separation and lacuna. It's basically the same sort of idea. And some people actually do this on purpose, but obviously the fabric has been broken to beyond its stress point, and this is the analogy I'm making here between the iris and people who have ripped genes. In fact, the pattern is so popular that they even use these ripped gene images on cell phone case designs. So my point is it's not necessarily problematic. It doesn't have to be seen as a bad thing, and that's, again, in the Rayid model there is no such thing as a bad iris pattern. However, you'll also find a difference between the lacunas in a brown iris and those in a blue iris. In the brown iris, they're typically only visible around the collarette, or the glandular ring, which corresponds to, on the topographic chart, of the range of sites that are correlated to the condition of your endocrine system. In the blue iris, there's a transparent layer there, so it's much easier to see the underlying structure. Here's an electron microscope image also showing how there will be gaps in the top surface, and they will show up as ovals or flowers in the Rayid model, or lacuna as in the conventional iridology model. Here's a close-up of the crypt of Fuchs. Again, it's a lacuna. You can see small strands of collagen fiber, but remember this topographic feature has to stretch out from being very long and narrow when the pupil is small to being wide open when it's a dilated pupil. And these are changes the normal iris makes when it goes from a bright scene to a dark room. So that's within the physiological range. Here we have a photograph of the light blue iris with the typical sinusoidal wavy pattern. These are blood vessels here. They're not actually fibers, but it's okay to refer to them as such. And the fact in the blue iris is that the top layer is actually transparent, and that's why we can see these radial sinusoidal fibers. And the other point here is that these are actually in a corkscrew shape. They're in a helix or like a spiral, and that they're kind of like a coil spring, so that when the iris is dilated, they coil up, and they don't have to be dislocated, and they don't have to stretch. They just need to coil up like a spring. But when its same specimen is prepared for a scanning electron microscope by depositing a layer of gold atoms, the top clear surface now becomes opaque and it looks practically the same as your typical brown iris. And of course you can see the contraction furrows, the circumferential contraction furrows in this photo much better. So everybody has these contraction furrows, even if you can't see them as in a clear blue iris. That doesn't mean they don't exist, and they must exist in order for the iris to bunch up when the pupil is dilated. So there's not only the circumferential contraction furrows, but there's also the radial contraction furrows where the iris has to bunch up when the pupil is small. And this is just a comparison of those two pictures of the same specimen to illustrate how in the blue iris we do actually have a thin, sort of like cling wrap film on top of the iris. And this electron micrograph shows both a radial contraction fold as well as the circumferential folds. And again, every iris will have these whether you can see them or not, and it has to have these in order to accommodate the tissue of the iris during extreme dilation, as when you're in a dark room, or extreme contraction when you're going out in the direct sunlight. The interesting thing about iris color is that up until about 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, every person had a brown iris. This has been thoroughly researched and documented, and it turns out that there was a single mutation in a single person, and I'm being, conservative and saying 10,000. It could be 6,000 or 8,000, but that's a good estimate. But up until then, every single iris was actually brown. What this means is that all blue-eyed humans have a single common ancestor, and you could also say the same of the mixed iris. If it's not a brown iris, they have this one person in common as a distant ancestor. Today, fully 90%, plus or minus a few percentage points, of all people on the earth have a brown iris. And I found that much of the conventional beliefs regarding iridology, and even in Rayid, are all spend much of their time discussing traits that only appear in blue and mixed iris. So this is probably because iris analysis was developed in Germany and Eastern Europe, where the blue iris was overrepresented. It also points out that there's less information that we have on the blue and the brown iris compared to the blue iris, but it's important to realize that 9 out of 10 people actually have a brown iris. Of course, in North Europe, the iris color distribution is quite a bit different. You'll have half or 2/3 or more, especially in the Scandinavian areas, with blue iris. So this is where all the, a lot of the research and development has taken place. But when you go down closer to the tropical or the equatorial areas, there's not a lot of native people with a light blue or green eye. And this has been studied many times, and as you can see, it's 50 to 80% of North Europe has got light eyes. It's blue or green. But outside of this zone in North America, of course, where many of these people migrated, the most people do have the brown iris. Likewise with the hair pigmentation, it's equally similarly distributed, and we should be aware that it's just a small part of the world that has blonde hair and blue eyes. And this map summarizes that pigmentation of hair and eyes in Europe and shows how that we have kind of a hot spot right there near in the Scandinavian areas. And this is, as I say, only about 10% of the world. So the range of color I've classified into about 6 different types, and ranging from the blue with virtually no freckles or color deposit at all, the central heterochrome where the color seems to be deposited in the central zone only, than the typical freckled pattern that appears in both blue and very light brown iris. And then there's the medium light brown iris where it's darker typically in the central zones. And then the pure true brown iris, where these types of iris don't generally have much freckling going on. They don't have the freckles because they have so much pigment that they don't have that phototropic response that is found among the more light-skinned peoples. And the blue iris is actually not pigmented blue, it just looks blue due to what's called the Tyndall effect, where when there's particles, like in this opalescent glass, it will appear blue from the side because the light is being scattered mostly blue wavelengths, the shorter wavelengths, towards the viewer, where the longer wavelengths, as you can see, orange light goes right through it. And this is similar, but not exactly the same as the reason that the sky is blue. That's actually the Rayleigh scattering, but this is Tyndall's scattering. The effect is also seen, you can run in this experiment, just dissolve some flour, particles of finely ground flour into water, and it'll look a bit blue because when the light hits it, the shorter wavelengths that are close to the diameter of the water in the pigment, the flour particles are scattered back to the viewer, so it actually looks a little bit blue. The architecture of the iris is quite interesting because, as it turns out, as you can see in figure A, is a cross-section of a dark brown iris, and clearly the rear surface is heavily pigmented and the top surface has brown pigment. But in between, well, it's kind of like an Oreo cookie, so it's actually white if you were to look at it, whitish bluish. And this is a dark brown iris in figure A, and this illustrates with the rear surface on the bottom and the top surface on the top that it's only the outer layers of the iris which have developed this pigmentation. In figure B, you can also see a cross-section, and you can actually see both the top pigmented layer and the rear surface, which also has the circumferential contraction furrows that are necessary for the iris to bunch up when a person goes into a dark room and they need to have a larger pupil. And when they go out in the sun, figure C shows how the inner boundary, the inner pupil border as it's sometimes referred to, is going to have to bunch up somehow in order to let that tissue go somewhere. So that's why we have this pigment rough little beaded feature of the rear surface wrapping around to the inner edge of the pupil. Here's a cross-section of the iris, and on the right surface you can see the top layer has a very thin layer of pigment particles. The rear surface has a much thicker layer. It's actually black, and this is true for both the blue and the brown iris. However, it's only the brown iris that has that range of the thin layer of pigment on the right surface, which is the top. Then we get to freckles, which are quite interesting, also known as pigment patches or jewels in the Rayid model. And here you can see that the pigment patches tend to be building up in a kind of a reticulated formation until they get so dense that they become solid. But these are all on the top surface of the iris, and they almost look as though they're deposited there. And they are often situated right where the vasculature, the fibers, are turning corners or aggregating into larger clumps. The other type of pigment is the central pigment, and that is also on the surface, the top surface, and it appears to be preferentially towards the center. And I have a theory that this is due to deposits of blood products during the normal circulation of the aqueous fluid, which is produced behind the iris, comes through the pupil opening, and is drained out through the periphery in the front surface of the iris. And it almost looks like they get drawn or attracted to the top surface either through chemotaxis or magnetic attraction, and then they just settle there. And the exact mechanism whereby these freckles develop in the iris is not well understood. Some people have a lot of freckles, some people don't have any, but they tend to have more on the bridge of the nose and also the top of the cheeks where they get sun exposure. So it is related to solar exposure. And when a person is born, they actually don't have any freckles at all. This is a time-delayed effect of some type of genetic response, which is definitely triggered by a light impact. And remember, during gestation, the baby doesn't have any light hitting it at all. And so the formation of color spots, freckles, jewels, and so on is all related to the stimulation by light. And here you can see the freckles on the cheek where the light hits. And in older people, they get what you might know as liver spots or age spots, and these tend to form after several decades. And again, they're more common in the equatorial tropical latitudes, but they're also related to both age as well as solar exposure. Now we look at various factors that affect the color and texture of the iris, and the key consideration is the vasculature. So I've mentioned that the radial fibers are actually blood vessels. Some of them are very fine capillaries, and what is known as lacuna and rarefaction, those are actually properties of the vasculature. And the vessels there are ensheathed with collagen, but the blood and aqueous barrier, which is important to maintain so that you have clarity in the aqueous chamber, clear fluid inside the front of the eye, is maintained in order to prevent cloudy media, preventing clear vision. But blood products are definitely related to the pigmentation. And when you see a faint gradient of color, that's always on the top surface of the iris, almost as though it has settled there during the circulation. Just to show the point that the blood system is extremely important to the body, we are known to have about 37 trillion cells making up our body. And surprisingly, 25 trillion of these are red blood cells in the normal person. And if you count the platelets, which are also blood cells, 1.5, that turns out 72% of your body's cells are blood cells. And that's quite significant to me, and it shows the importance. The blood is the carrier of oxygen and nutrients to every tissue in the body. There's an illustration here of two types of pigment. One is the patch, and one is a punctate type of pigment. And these, again, show up later in life. They tend to show up in the early childhood and increase very slowly throughout the decades. But these are the two different types, and again, they're always on the top surface of the iris. In this illustration, you can see how the pigmentation is closely associated and even correlated with the presence of the vessels. So where some of the vessels are quite thick and clumped together, there will be more pigmentation. You'll see some pigmentation around the rim of a lacuna. And again, these are, I believe, settled there, various blood products which either leak out through the blood aqueous barrier, or they are attracted to the moving iron as a magnetic force from various microscopic granules that are present in the clear circulating fluid of the front anterior chamber. Here's an illustration of how much vascularity there is. The whole eye is supplied with nutrients and oxygen for cellular metabolism through a system of arteries, which are the red vessels flowing towards the front and the center of the iris, and the blue vessels are the return circuit of the arterial or the venous system, which has a suction effect to return the blood vessels back to the heart and lungs for replenishing the oxygen supply. But in this example, you can see how very dense the vascular is in the iris. In this example, you can see the actual pathways of the main anterior arteries, and this is the whole basis for all textural features of the iris. Here you can see a cross-section of the vessels, and these have been sliced with a microtome, but you can see the collagen sheathing surrounding each of these two blood vessels, and that is in order to maintain the blood aqueous barrier. We mustn't have the blood leaking out at this point when they're this diameter. In the capillaries, the blood cells get out into the tissues, but when there's a large pathway of these arteries, they must be surrounded by collagen in order to keep the blood from clouding up your vision. And there's a method called iris fluorescein angiography where some dye is injected into the antecubital vein, the upper part of your arm, and within 10 or 20 seconds this dye shows up in the iris and can be photographed with special filters and lighting so that we can see exactly where the blood is traveling. And here's an example of an iris angiogram, and as you can see, what we call fibers sometimes, they're actually blood vessels of various caliber, including arteries and veins, and the capillaries are the very smallest ones, but this is revealed by iris angiography. Here's another iris angiogram, and again, the dye with the special camera filter and illumination lights up so that we can actually follow where the blood is going. And this is commonly used to locate areas where the blood can leak into the anterior chamber. Now, I'd say that there's always going to be a tiny amount of leakage even in a normal person, but that's not necessarily problematic. However, I do believe that those blood products, which are typically broken up red blood cells, I believe they will eventually be drawn back to the outer surface of the vessels and show up as a fine dusting of pigment. That is what these pigment granules are derived from. And in this example, there's the case where there's actual significant leakage of the blood, and you can see on the right picture B what's called a smokestack effect, where the dye carried by the blood is able to seep out, and after the arteries bring the blood to the center of the iris at the pupil, it's supposed to do a U-turn and go back to the venous system, but sometimes a little bit leaks out. And these leakages, which can be subclinical and non-problematic, I believe are responsible for much of the surface deposited pigment granules. So when you see a picture like this, you'll know that these are all tiny little blood vessels, and that we are actually getting a image of the vascular bed. And this is useful for studies of diabetes, for example, where the vascularity is compromised at the capillary level. But it also, the image here shows that color, as in the deposit of fine pigment granules, tends to be coalescing around the larger caliber vessels. And here we have a plastic cast of where the blood vessels were. So in a sample of iris, before it's dismantled, liquid plastic resin is injected, allowed to perfuse the vasculature, and then it hardens, and then the actual original tissue is all dissolved with acid, and what's left is a plastic cast of where the vessels went. So this basically proves that all of those radial fibers are actually blood vessels. And this is just another plastic resin cast at the pupillary zone, with the edge of the pupil being at the bottom center. Now, the interpretation of these images where it gets interesting. But remember, anything that you image has got a single true structure, and all the images are just an approximation. So there's one true object, one true accurate image of the object, but many, many different interpretations, many beliefs come into play here, and the interpretive model is what this is about. So the interpretive model is based on all the features of the iris. And the conventional iridology model has the organs of the body situated around the circle of the iris, with the top part of the body at the upper zones, the midsection, the thorax, and the lungs and bronchial tubes in the mid zone, and then the lower portion of the body, like legs and kidneys and liver, those are down towards the bottom. And then the digestive tract is thought to correlate to the inner zone, the pupillary zone, and the glandular ring corresponds to the mid zone, where the endocrine system is depicted as here. And it's interesting to me to notice that the iris charts have pretty much been the same, and people generally just copy over other charts that they see. Lilliquist came out with this in 1893. It's not much different from von Pexley's, which was mid 1800s. And then even in this century, or this millennia, the charts are pretty much the same over the last 125 years. And yet, I don't know of any validation studies that have proved this. I mean, it makes sense, and it's kind of a neat parallel to the organization of the body, but there hasn't really been any proof that these charts are precise. There's also circumferential zones, so the inner two zones are the stomach and intestines, then the blood and glandular zone, and 3 is just outside the collarette, and beyond that is the mesenchyme and the skin zone. Deck has come up with a elaboration of the inner zone, the pupillary zone, as it shows different specific areas of the stomach, and you can see that in the chart on the left, and he's correlated it with actual specific stomach disorders. So now we go to the Rayid model, which is interesting because it's developed independently from all the other conventional iridology systems by Denny Johnson in the 1970s. And he's divided irises into 4 types, which are based on vertically. You go to stream to jewel is more pigmentation, and horizontally stream to flower is more lacuna. And so I would describe it as chromatic variation in the vertical axis and textural variation in the horizontal. And most people are somewhere in the middle, but they can have varying amounts of textural variations versus chromatic, and very few people are in the corners of this distribution. The Rayid model also has circumferential or annular zones, with the pupillary zone in the inner part depicting mental attributes, and the mid-zone, which corresponds to the gland ring, is the emotional attributes, and the outer zone is the physical attributes. And likewise, in the medial half of the iris, it tells us about the person's unconscious, subconscious, and the lateral is the conscious or conscious mind. The lower outer quadrants are usually the most important ones to consider, and they relate to social experience and emotions and expression. And in the right iris, these attributes pertain to relationships towards men. In the left iris, these attributes tell us about relationships towards women. And again, these are like yin and yang, and they are related to your parental relationships. So the jewel is the mental type, The personality tends to be thinking, analytical, verbal, and it's a very yin quality. And the tendency is towards the gifts of leadership, attention to detail, clarity, and their greatest fear is criticism, and they have difficulty letting go, and they don't want to be controlled. So there's a tendency of the jewel type to stay in a relationship for a long time, and that's that yin holding on to tendency. They find change difficult or challenging and tend to end up with a profession using the intellect. Here's a good example of a jewel iris. The opposite is the flower, and they have many lacunae showing around their iris, and they're much more yang, outgoing, emotional, feeling expressive, and they can be quite social, and they feel quite levels of joy and expression of that. And their greatest fears are of abandonment, separation, and rejection. So they tend to be emotion responders, and they're expressive and drawn to creative arts. They like to have ways to validate themselves with degrees, certificates, and very social towards other people typically. Here's an example. The collarette being quite large signifies an outer directed, and of course this is a flower. A couple of jewels, a little bit of shaker, but primarily an outer flower. So to summarize these types, and we'll revisit this diagram, but the flower is the emotional responder, which could also be called yang reactive. The jewel is a mental responder, yin reactive. Where the jewel tends towards denial, the flower tends towards expectations, both having them and following them. They're not afraid of engagement and confrontation. The jewels tend to avoid and suppress. The jewels tend to form mental habits, and the flower tends to form physical habits. The jewels are tending towards holding on to things, and the flowers tend to be in motion. Again, we mentioned the fears. And the anger in a flower is much more expressive and active, whereas with the jewel, the anger can be very passive, aggressive. These correspond to the psychological polarity. And again, this is all about the emotional makeup of a person. The yin, of course, is the jewel archetype, and yang is flower. These are opposites here, cathexis and catharsis. And additionally, the hemispheric dominance is shown by the eye that has more features is considered corresponding to the opposite hemisphere dominant, but right brain is considered yin. The directedness, about the size of the collarette, inner directed if the collarette's very small, outer directed if it's large. These also correspond to the classic Adharmic pattern of craving and aversion, fear and attachment, and where yin is to be in sorrow, yang is more like anger, and flight or fight is also corresponding to yin and yang. So here's another summary. Both jewel and stream are considered yin. Flower and shaker are considered yang. That's expansive, outward, letting go, forgetting, moving on, and the yin jewel tends to be contractive, holding on, having attachments, remembering the past, and they're more into input, perception, reading, watching, whereas the flower shaker type are yang, they're into more expression, doing, and writing. It corresponds neatly with the Rayid versus Myers-Briggs type. So we have the thinking and feeling dichotomy in the Myers-Briggs. That, of course, is the jewel flower dichotomy on the bottom. On the left, the introvert-extrovert corresponds to the Rayid inner-directed and outer-directed, where inner-directed means you like to do mainly what you want to do and less emphasis on what other people want. Outer-directed is more when you want to please other people and make sure you're doing what other people want, and that sort of corresponds to extroversion. And then for right brain dominant, that's intuitive, and whereas sensing is more like left brain, fact-based thinking. And finally, on the right, the judging and perceiving discrepancy is, or dichotomy, I should say, corresponds to shaker and stream, yang and yin again. And this is a typical worksheet where, with the Rayid model, you can mark the structure of the eye first, known as type, hemispheric dominance, left brain, right brain. Now there's usually a primary dominance and a secondary one is where you were maybe opposite hemisphere born, but then your dominance shifted, so you're like, in this case, right brain going left as a compensation mechanism. And directedness, that doesn't really change very much. It's primarily the size of the collarette. So if the collarette's smaller than the inner zone, that will be inner-directed, as in this case. Rings are ring of freedom, harmony, purpose, and determination, and these are all different types of circular patterns. And finally, there are positions in the Rayid system, and with a sheet like this, you can mark whether there's jewels or flowers or both in each of the 46 zones. And when I do a report, I like to annotate the iris with a red oval signifying the yang flower pattern, and the blue square is the yin type of attribute of the jewel, and then that can be looked up in a table and you can generate the report accordingly. I took this picture, and when the client looked at it, she was quite dismayed having all these freckles, and she thought that it looked kind of messy, or maybe somebody told her that means there's toxins or problems. But in the Rayid model, there's no such thing as a bad iris, and these actually indicate special gifts and talents. Here we have a case, there's flowers here, but there's also a lot of jewels, so this is actually a shaker type. Outer directed, with the collarette being that large. This is the stream type, which is very tight weave and not a whole lot of flowerness, and only a little bit of jewel pattern here. So again, these textural features are determined during gestation, and I'm going to step through briefly on some of the iris development that takes place. Most of the iris formation occurs during the second half of the pregnancy, 3rd to 8th month. Prior to that, there isn't really very much, and there certainly isn't the muscular formation, and the nerve system is still developing as well. So here we're looking at a 2-month-old fetus, embryo actually at this stage it's called, and you can see the very fine trace of the iris in the mid-zone. The cornea is the arched dome on the top, item A, and the big circle in the middle is the lens, which is still forming. Later, during the 3rd month, we have the lens progressing in its shape, and the iris actually stretches across the entire floor of the anterior chamber, and you can see the cornea is also in development here. At 5 months, the iris is still underway, and the dark zone down at the bottom, the dark band, that's the pigment, which becomes the choroid of the retina towards the right and down the rear, and the iris is still being developed, but this is where the formation of that texture is taking place. In this photo, this research was done about 90 years ago. There hasn't been a whole lot of recent work because people don't really want to cut up fetuses these days, but 90 years ago they didn't care. And it's showing that the vessels are actually in place pretty much by 5.5 months. The sector on the left, marked A, is missing some of the vessels because they got torn away during the preparation of the specimen. But as you can see, the blood vessels are being laid down here first, and behind it you can actually see the stroma of the iris, which is quite a bit larger pupil diameter here. Here's 7 months, and you can see the rear surface, and this is the iris developing. Here you see the fine vessels. The vasculature is in formation here at 7 months. This is when the texture is being formed. And here's an example where you can actually see the vessels, and they're kind of separating and pulling back, and there's some fine strands that are overlapping the opening of the pupil. And this is a normal human iris at 7 months gestation. Here's 8.5 months. There's still a few strands that are left out into the pupil area, but everything is being formed, and the iris muscles are in effect now, and they are widening the pupil diameter. And here's a full-term iris, and you can see some of the vessels connecting various segments of the collarette, but for the most part the vasculature has good parallelism in the mid and peripheral zones. Here we have the surface view of an iris of a 65-year-old man, and you can see there's a few specks, jewels there. And now my hypothesis here is that these openings in the iris surface are kind of ripped there during the dynamics of the pupil in utero. While the vessels are being laid down, there could be stress and strain causing the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system to alternate and change the pupil size, and so consequently we get lacuna. The iris can experience a wide range of contraction. From on the left is extreme meiosis. That's when the parasympathetic is active, and mydriasis is where the sympathetic nervous system. These are autonomic nervous system signals that are often given when there's fears or danger felt by the person. And anxiety and fear are two twin feelings, and these, I believe, can take place in utero and affect the development of the iris. The endocrine system is part of the control signal network, where hormones are released into the bloodstream as control messenger molecules, and as a result we have some loss of vascular parallelism, in not every case obviously, but in those cases where both there's a predisposition to a fear response, but also actual emotional dynamics taking place during the manufacturing process of these iris patterns. And again, you can see the jewels situated right there where the blood vessels are. Here's a photo of some iris where it's in the upper picture is constricted, stretched out, and dilated, and the left edge is the same. So there's quite a large range of stretching that has to take place. And this will cause some shifts in the fiber, the vessels. This is a scissors effect here due to mechanical strain as a consequence of pupil dynamics. And this is the photo we've seen earlier where the same iris was taken with and without a bright light, and you can see the wavy pattern of the radial vessels in the upper illustration. They're like a corkscrew or a coil spring being squished, compressed. In the lower, when it's time for the parasympathetic to bring the pupil diameter down, these coils are stretched out so they're practically straight. It's a lot to do with the fight or flight response. So these mechanisms, I believe, are taking place in utero at the second half of pregnancy and will affect the formation of the iris architecture. Now, the triune brain is an interesting model because it shows how the inner brain, the core, the brain stem, also known as reptilian brain, is concerned only with instinct and survival, and it controls the autonomic nervous system. It keeps your heart pumping the blood, and it keeps your lungs breathing. It keeps all systems go. It's basically automatic, which is why it's called autonomous nervous system. The limbic system is more developed in mammals, and also known as the mammalian brain. Mammals have limbs, and that's why it's called limbic, and they have emotions that correspond to gestures, hand waving, climbing trees, things like that. That's the emotional brain. And then among primates, and the higher primates such as people, the neocortex is the cortex which controls speech, logic, higher thinking, symbolic reasoning. And just to illustrate, the horse, which is a mammal, has the mammalian brain and the reptilian, which is the autonomic nervous system, the brainstem. But humans have this neo-mammalian, which is only found in primates. But this reptilian brain, the brainstem, like the medulla oblongata, it's only concerned with survival, aggression, territory, having control over the environment. The mammalian brain is primarily concerned with emotions, and of course the rational brain is all the symbolic thinking, higher order intellectual process. And a person named Sian de Rohan has written a book called Feelings Matter, which I recommend. It goes into detail about how the reptilian brain is imprinted with many different survival fears upon birth, just before, during, and after birth. The early child experience can create a deep imprinting of the reptilian brain. And this can interfere with the development of the emotional brain. That can be suppressed. And the neocortex, when the person starts getting rational and thinking for themselves and aged 7, 8, 9, 10 or so, that can also tend to suppress the emotional brain if there was emotional injuries. So just to summarize, this imprinting of stress in early childhood and second half of pregnancy, the brainstem controls the autonomic nervous system, reflex response, and it's primarily concerned with survival fears and anxieties. The limbic brain, emotional, is about memories and feelings. The neocortical brain is all about the cognitive response. But it's important to appreciate that when a person is born, the newborn is suddenly faced with a significant change in living conditions. Survival is uncertain and contingent on the behavior of the others who are around. And several people have been researching emotional trauma in the womb. Dr. Victoria has done this quite a bit, and you can see his work online. But he has worked with people who carry around their early childhood imprinting. Until they release it and understand it, they will not change during their life. And here's a few more quotes. He found that consciousness can occur within as soon as month 4 of gestation. He has methods for releasing this, and the epigenetic study of the Dutch famine has also shown that in utero influences of epigenetics can affect a person's emotional condition. Here's a few other researchers that are studying prenatal stress and ultimate child behavior patterns. So to summarize this part, I'd say that the iris is kind of like a radiation badge that people wear when they're working on radiation sites. And it basically is a record of the various emotional injuries that were sustained in utero. So this importance of these early life emotional injuries can't be underestimated. We carry them around with our whole life until we can access them and release them. And that's why the Rayid model, I believe, is so effective, because it's looking at the iris from the standpoint of the imprinting that occurs during the second half of pregnancy and even infancy, because the color specks tend to form during the first few years of life. The remedy here is to revisit, accept, and release those various imprinted fears. But people are fundamentally emotional beings, and many health concerns, pretty much all, I believe, have an underlying emotional cause. So, for example, if a person has a disorder of the gastric system, it may be that they're eating unhealthy foods as a chronic habit all their life, but that what they put into their body is based on their emotional disorders, and it would be best to address the underlying emotions and make a sincere soul shift forward. In order to do this, one has to address and release these emotional causes. There's a lot of denial here with held emotions and any type of stuckness, habits where people don't seem to change very much, patterns of avoidance. Those all need to be freed up by freeing up the emotional flow. To do this, one must face the truth with honesty and sincerity. One must spend a good amount of time exploring their early childhood feelings and discussing with others or reviewing it with yourself. You have to maintain an attitude of humility, which is the opposite of arrogance or thinking that you already know it all and have everything figured out. You have to be open to the possibility that you might not have it figured out. So I have developed this emotional impedance method of analysis because I've seen that emotional reluctance to change is the primary obstacle to progress. Each person needs to accept total responsibility for their own condition and responsibility for improving it. So the goal then in these terms become to reduce that personal resistance to change and truth. So to make an analogy here, there's a gravitational force of attraction and the electrostatic force of attraction, and this is a well-known correspondence with the same exact formula structure. Or another example of resistance is when you try to compress a spring, it will resist it proportionate to the amount of force, and same with the elongation of the spring. And I've actually studied this in great detail, although I won't go into it. There's time here today, but the impedance is inductance, resistance, and capacitance, and the pressure and flow is present at all different levels of physics, including electrical, magnetic, mechanical, and thermal. These are all different aspects of resistance, or in more complex terms, impedance. So this is a formula which these will be available online. But the analogy here is that corresponding to electric charge, we have emotional charge. Corresponding to electrical current, we have emotional flow. So if a person is not having a sufficient emotional flow, it's like a circuit that doesn't have very much amperage going through it. And will and desire correspond to force and voltage. And so if there's too much resistance, there won't be very much will. There won't be enough will to change or to improve or desires. So these can all be summed up in one phrase, a motive impedance, which has three components: the inductive reactance, that's reactance is the first and third type, and this relates to inertia, habits, and held beliefs. Capacitive reactance is anxiety and avoidance, and in between is the reluctance or resistance, which is like friction, that's the denial and judgment. Here's some equations that I have sketched out earlier, and as you can see, there's a direct correspondence between emotive force and mechanical, electromotive, or magnetomotive force. And these are all parallel equations. So the emotive force, as I say, is desire, will, and passion. Emotive impedance is the real problem, though, because that's the resistance and reactance that people have. So the health plan here approach is to reduce that impedance so that people can change and they can feel. The inductive type of reactance is habit, addiction, and arrogance, thinking you have it all figured out. And in this case, energy, like with an inductor, is stored in motion. The emotive reluctance corresponds to resistance, which is like friction, and that corresponds to denial, judgment, anger, disappointment. And these types of resistance, energy is lost to friction. In capacitive reactance, the energy is stored in the separation of charge, and here we have anxiety, avoidance, distance. These patterns are capacitive in nature. And here you could see, in the case of the flower dominant person, they primarily yang reactive, and this is the inductive type of impedance. The jewel is yin reactive, and this is the capacitive type of reactance. So the model is designed to represent how emotions flow. And as I mentioned, the big concern with getting people to change their habits and health is the resistance or reluctance to change. So we consider flow and pressure. That's like desire and will and feeling. The main concern, most people have too much impedance, and resistance is like friction, and the narrowing of a fluid conduit is like the resistance to change, or people who are shut down, older people, and the reactive component is the inductive and capacitive types. So the goal is to increase the flow by reducing the emotional impedance. And by understanding the various reactive components, we can know what needs addressing. The iris helps to give you clues as to where a person's emotional impedance is, whether it's inductive or capacitive primarily. So going to habits and addictions, I found in my research in healthcare methodologies that the biggest problem is getting the client to want to improve their lifestyle. You can't just give them a shopping list for supplements or put them on some program or medication. None of that is going to have any effect if they're still interested in going to drive-thrus and eating junk food and all of this. So I've come up with this concept of the arc of temptation and the pleasure curve. So taking it for an example, something that's fun but not very healthy, a burger or a beer or both, there's a curve here of temptation, and where you get a little jolt, and then after a while that you're done with that, it goes down, and you actually may feel a little bit worse after a while. And then the net change is kind of not feeling so good afterwards. And the strategy here is to visualize this entire sequence before you succumb to temptation and remember how you felt afterwards. Then you can compare this to something healthy, like a salad with Vidalia onions and butter lettuce and organic heirloom tomatoes and tahini dressing. And you notice afterwards you feel actually better than you started, and so the net change is positive. Then if you, well actually there's been recent research, this just came out a couple days ago, but the University of Warwick's found that you can actually make a huge difference in a person's well-being just by making sure they have vegetables or a salad every day. So you choose, you make choices every day, and they will add up to your current health condition, and you can advise your clients similarly. So it's a choice. And of course the concern is after you repeat these patterns, in the upper graph, after a while, you keep dropping lower and lower on your well-being curve. In the lower graph, with the salad and water instead of alcohol and mate, you can actually increase your net change. And this is something to visualize ahead of time. Now there's a way of graphing a person's well-being over time, and people have their own life and their own pattern. A lot of them go up and down. But they end early. Some of these curves drop out early than others. But these can all be assessed. And over on the right, you'll see that circle at the cross 0 point. That is the early childhood influence. And I believe that these set the pattern of the curve for the rest of one's life until you process these changes, these early emotional injuries. You're going to be set on a curve. And it turns out now recently emotion curves are used to analyze the stories in films. In the case of the Harry Potter stories, the curve goes up and down, and the vertical axis in this illustration is happiness. And they end up slightly above, somewhat above the average, so happily ever after. Point being here is that we do have these curves of up and down. Then they actually studied 1,700 stories and did lexical analysis of the words to find out whether the words are conveying positive or negative emotions. And here's the curve for Romeo and Juliet, which ends up a lot lower than it started out. So that's why it's considered a tragedy. You don't need to have your life that way, though, because you have some control over this. As a matter of fact, out of the 1,700 stories, they found they could group all the emotion curves into 6 types. And interestingly, there's 3 of each type that are mirror opposites. So in the upper left is a rise, the middle top is fall rise, and then the upper right is rise fall rise. And then the other types, these are actual plots of computer generated data. It's quite interesting. To help reduce your impedance, recognize that you fall short of the mark. Basically, you're not perfect, and as long as you can acknowledge that, that is step 1, that there is room for improvement. Here, I'm kind of being kind of fun here, showing the sine of the angle corresponds to the concept of sin. which is just falling short of the mark. It's not a loaded term in Greek. It just means in archery you didn't hit the mark. So step 2 is to always want to seek to improve your condition. I like to call it error detection and correction. And then the last graph here is this is something to visualize and shoot for, and you can have your goal be, you know, leaving the world in a better condition than you started, and a constantly improving happiness. And finally, I have a few extra notes here in case someone wants to study this later on in the future. I'll go into a lot more detail on this. But that's basically the story I have for today, and appreciate your time, and thank you for your attention. At this point, I can take any possible questions there may be, and otherwise you can get more information by contacting me directly. Yeah, I'm glad you found it interesting there. Yeah, like I say, I've been spending a lot of time just pondering the significance of the iris, and you know, the first recognition is that it doesn't really change that much, but it does tell us a lot about how we were formed. And other research I've been doing shows that how important it is to go back to your early imprinting. Ask your siblings if you have them, or if your parents, if they're still around, for various significant emotional events. And it doesn't have to be done in an attitude of fear, but just curiosity. And if you spend some time actually going back in your own memories, you'll find that after a while you remember, oh yeah, that happened, and oh yeah, I never got over that. And the key is to get over it by revisiting those early emotional traumas, and just sit with that feeling and allow them to flow, and allow it to flow through your body, because emotions are not meant to be held, they're meant to flow, and there's nothing to be afraid of about emotions. But so many people are in denial and avoidance of these unpleasant early experiences that as long as you're not addressing them, whether you were abused or injured or hurt, you're just not going to progress any further. So I suggest anyone who is feeling stuck in any way to go back in time, and maybe even in their early childhood or even their adolescence, and revisit those feelings and think about them, and you can actually make a lot of progress that way. Well, it turns out you have a multitude of blood vessels throughout your whole body. It's just that you can see them more clearly in the iris, because it has to be clear. The ocular media has to be clear in order for you to have your sight of vision. And it turns out that this is really not particularly more vascularized than any other area. If you look at the retina, if you see retinal photos, they have even more blood vessels, but we're able to see them more clearly, and it's simply because there's so much transparent tissue in the eye in order to allow for light to get all the way back to the back of the eye where the retina is. It's just not so much that there's any more vessels in the iris than, say, in the sclera. It's just that you can see them better. And if you think back to that vascular diagram of the whole globe of the eye, there's just thousands and thousands of vessels, and that's why I made the point that the blood is so important, and it is the only thing that keeps you alive is blood cells delivering nutrients and oxygen to every tissue. So everyone has a lot of blood vessels everywhere. It's just that we are able to see them, especially in the blue iris. In the brown iris, it's not as easy to see them. And also that fluorescein iris angiography method for the iris, they can't really do that with the brown iris because the top layer is so pigmented you can't see the dye in the vessels. You can only do iris fluorescein angiography on a light colored blue iris. And so that just shows again that we have vessels everywhere. We just happen to see them better in the iris.
We have another comment with a little question at the end, and it says, I feel like I was a mix of flower and jewel types. I also had mixed type in Myers-Briggs, which I never liked because I had both qualities. Does that make sense?
Yes, well, of course, as I've mentioned in prior discussions, everybody has some flowerness and some jewelness. And if you think back to that chart with the circle and the pie sectors, most people are actually in the middle. It's like a bell curve, actually. So most people are kind of a mix of traits, and it's a few people are going to be outliers where they've got a lot of jewels and no flowers, and there's a few people with a lot of flowers and no jewels, but those are actually the exception. There's most people do have a combination of traits, but with regard to my model of emotional impedance, I think the key is to recognize that the flower traits are the inductive reactants, and the jewel traits are the capacitive reactants. So you have two types of resistance to change and resistance to truth. And if you can look at the zones on the positions, I should say, on the Rayid chart, you'll get some more insight into. My major point is that we are each holding ourselves back more than anybody else. Nobody is holding you back more than yourself. Everybody is holding themselves back to some extent. We should face that truth. So the key is to identify where are the points of resistance for you to improve your lifestyle. And if you have both jewels and flowers, that just means you have two categories of resistance factors to identify. But it's only up to you. You can't just go to a practitioner. If a person is skilled, they can definitely help you, but each person is responsible for their own well-being.
Yes. The next question comment is, you use the Myers-Briggs. If you ever use the Enneagram.
Well,
So the
yeah,
gentleman that wrote this says that he finds that works much better for understanding
right,
rather
yes.
than
I
relationships.
agree. The Enneagram is a nine-way division of typology, and I found it was quite accurate. Of course, I was found to be the investigator type because I like to do research, and but I also found the Myers-Briggs was pretty accurate as well. However, in reference to the prior question, there are people who don't necessarily fall into just one category, but they tend to have one dominant. And so, yeah, I would say that the Enneagram it appears to be valid to my experience of using it. But I find that a person might, the problem with these tests like the Myers-Briggs, which I wouldn't normally use that, but I just thought it was interesting to mention, and the Enneagram and pretty much anything else. I know people who spend their whole life doing astrology analysis and reports, but the problem is that people will tend to adopt an image of what they want to be, and it isn't necessarily going to match what their core attributes are. The reason is they may be laboring under these influences of emotional injuries that made them not want to be a certain way or want to be some other way. And the only way you can find out your true core self, which is actually your soul, is by addressing all of the beliefs you have about yourself and see if that's really true. I mean, the short answer is yeah, I think there's some value to the Enneagram and the Myers-Briggs, but I wouldn't put all your eggs in that basket. I would say your first objective is to just forget everything you believe and try to go to who you really are. And that's a real challenge when you're looking at a lot of denial and avoidance and tightly held beliefs. But this is why it's very helpful to release all of these resistance factors. Once again, I keep coming back to that because I find that people tend to cling to their cherished beliefs. And they may not be accurate. They could be some little incident in your childhood made you want to be an intellect and deny your feelings. And, oh yeah, I'm a jewel, so I'm only interested in information. And I don't like all that emotional, messy stuff. And that's not for me. Well, this isn't really true because the emotional circuits are very, very important to all people. So I suggest that nobody gets too attached to any one system of analysis.
I think you stated that there's no bad iris. So does that mean that the lacuna are not weaknesses, as many iridologists think? This is another question.
Well, this is my contention that the iris is more like, as I mentioned, a radiation badge that gives you clues as to what you went through during the formation process of your iris. But you're not a prisoner of your emotional injuries. This is the amazing thing about each person. And it helps to have a more advanced model, which I would like to go into in the future, where we are actually a soul at our core being. And the soul, we have a physical body and a spirit body, which is sort of like our emotional body. But the important thing here is to realize that your body and your iris, it's not necessarily to be seen as a definition of who you are. You're much more than that. You can be whoever you want to be in a large extent, but that yes, I would say that the fiber separation, rarefaction, lacuna, this has been taught as a sign of inherent weakness, and I think it's cruel to give that advice to your clients because it makes them feel hopeless, that they are saddled with, a weak constitution, when if they had the proper emotional health condition, none of that would really matter, and they could be happier than the person who has the tight weave, stream, pure blue, parallel vasculature and fibers and all that. I mean, some of the people I've seen who have the pure ideal iris as described or believed by the Germans, they're into the whole, racial purity and everything back turn of the century. But those people are not necessarily happier or better off, and they might be high strung. Lots of times I find stream people are tense and high strung, whereas the emotional type, the emotion responder who has lots of flowers, they're more laid back and easygoing, and they go with the flow, and they don't hang on to anger and resentment and all of these negative feelings because they're yang and they can let it go. And so they can be actually in a much healthier emotional condition than the person who has the classically defined pure perfect blue straight weave, silk textured iris. And I suggest you don't use the iris to classify people as a way of trying to define their true nature, that their true nature is much, much beyond whatever their body signs are. And that is actually a ray of hope, because I can't tell you how many people I've taken their pictures and they're just totally disappointed with all the features that they see in their iris. And I believe a lot of damage is done by this false teaching that there's a bad iris and a good iris. We need to move away from that, and we need to see the iris as for what it is. And like I said, I'm sort of staying with this radiation badge concept, but we do get irradiated with a lot of injurious emotions in our early childhood. I know I have, and I don't really have any lacuna in my iris, and I pretty much have one large jewel and lots of little ones, but my upbringing was, where emotions were not really expressed, and I'm learning the importance of accepting emotional dynamics, and that's actually one of the motivations for me to go into this subject. So yeah, I would say don't tell people that they have an inherent weakness, because they might get hopeless about their health condition, and the next thing you know, they're just going to be angry and go to drive-thru and say, "What's the point?" And it doesn't work that way. It's all about your unlimited possibility for health, and it's only going to happen when you attain emotional health first.
John, that's one of the things that IPA teaches, is that there is no such thing as a bad iris. Just because you may have the lacuna or the genetic marking in the eye does not mean that you're going to have the problem, and it is going to be a weakness. So, to think that that is somewhat of a detriment to your health, that's an old 40 or 50-year-old thought concept. And so for those students that are IPA trained and even IPA certified iridologists, we know that that is pretty much of a falsehood now. So hopefully IPA is starting to change some of those old past theories and concepts about that.
That's right, and Ellen Jensen has clued me into that, and I think it's an excellent trend, but it's a very recent trend, and I can't tell you how many people are still clinging to the old beliefs, and it's good to dispel those. And that's what attracted me to the Rayid model, because in the Rayid model, it's clear right from the outset that there's no such thing as a difficult or bad iris. And now it's good to hear that, modern iris analysts are recognizing that fact, that you're not a prisoner of your iris and you're not defined by your iris. It's just a set of clues, and each person needs to pay attention to the clues around them, but they're not forced into any hopeless condition that's unchangeable, because after all, let's face it, nobody can eliminate their lacuna. That's just a part of your record. And if you see it as a record of your emotional injuries in utero, then you realize, well, I can move past that, and I can learn from those experiences. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. So I appreciate that IPA is acknowledging that there doesn't need to be so much judgment surrounding a person's iris. But I also have to point out that it's widespread belief that it's a very, very commonplace.
Okay, we'll take this. This is a final question since we're getting on up there in time. But the comment is, I think you stated that the pigmentation marks are not poisons and are not caused by pharmaceuticals, as many iridologists state, and therefore need to be cleaned up. Similarly, can we, oh, can we not get rid of the lacuna and get the finer, perfect, straight, weaved silk iris?
Yeah, I would say, as I just mentioned, there's no way anybody could ever change the texture or the structure of their iris. So that's basically a fool's errand, and you're bound to be heading down the road of frustration and despair if that's what you want to do. So that's why it's important to recognize that the texture of your iris doesn't define who you are. It's just a record of what you went through. In other words, it's all happened during the manufacturing process, but it's not even that important. After you are done with your physical body, after 90, 100 years, you go to the spirit world and it doesn't even matter anymore. What does matter is your emotional well-being. And it's very important not to get discouraged by some belief from some German person 100 years ago that said everybody should ideally have the perfect blemish-free iris. Now, as far as the jewels go and the color spots, as I say, I like the Rayid model because it sees those as indicating special gifts and talents. Now, they might indicate some difficulty that was experienced at some point, but that doesn't have to be necessarily problematic. It can be something that you learn from. After all, if you have no challenges and everything is handed to you like so easily, you aren't going to learn as much and you're not going to evolve. So you need to acknowledge that any difficulties, including health challenges that you may have, are something that you have to respect as, I have a nice challenge here, and I'm glad I have a challenge because if I didn't, I wouldn't progress.
Very good. Okay. Well, I believe that you have covered a wide array of topics tonight, and you've kept it all together, and you've proven that your research is absolutely enormous in
Thank you.
what you've brought to us tonight.
All
So
right.
I am thrilled, John, that you could bring this class to our IPA members. It's been a wonderful evening, and I know that everybody has enjoyed it. Um, and I'm sure that they will be contacting you soon, maybe to know more or to bounce off some ideas or some more questions from you.
Oh,
So
yeah, that's fine. I'll look forward to
very
that.
good. Okay. Well,
Okay.
for those that are attending our rebroadcast of this, the recording will be out tomorrow, hopefully by noon. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you to John and bid everyone a good evening. Thank you for joining us. Like I said earlier, our next HIPAA webinar will be August the 31st with Beer Get Looters. Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.